Avery Guest was born in New York in 1940, but grew up in Texas. He attended Oberlin College in Ohio, then received a master's degree in journalism from Columbia University in 1964. He worked as a reporter for the Akron Beacon Journal for a couple of years before starting the sociology doctoral program at the University of Wisconsin. When he completed his PhD in 1970, he started his academic career at Dartmouth, but quickly moved to the University of Washington in Seattle, where he remained until his retirement in 2003. He's known to colleagues in the academic world simply as Pete. Catherine Curtis White came to the University of Washington in 1998 with a bachelor's degree in sociology from the University of Montana. She was one of the last doctoral students in the department to work with Pete Guest. This article they published together appeared in 2003, the same year that he retired, and she also completed her doctoral degree that same year. After a postdoctoral fellowship to the University of Wisconsin, she taught briefly at Brown University, but returned to Madison in 2007 as a professor in the Department of Community and Environmental Sociology, where she works today. Special questions asked only on the 1985 round of the National General Social Survey allowed Guest and Curtis White to actually measure the social networks reported by people living in different places. So here they compare patterns in these networks to what we would expect from the urban anomie theory of Louis Wirth, the compositional approach of Oscar Lewis or Herbert Gans, and the subcultural theory of Claude Fisher. Even though people like Claude Fisher put forward alternative ideas like his subcultural theory, and even though other writers, especially anthropologists, questioned whether urban anomie theory had it right, the legacy of Louis Wirth and the Chicago School has continued to dominate both scholarship and the popular imagination about city life. One of the problems with urban anomie theory, as we have seen, is that it makes a good story, especially when told by convincing writers, but neither Wirth nor some of his most well-known students bothered to present much in the way of actual empirical evidence to support the theory. Appearing about 20 years after Fisher's first suggestions about urban subcultures, attempts to set up these different theories of urban life side by side and to see about testing them against some empirical evidence from real cities. The authors review the details for us of both Wirth's urban anomie theory and Fisher's subcultural theory, and try to develop some basic hypotheses for which the two theoretical perspectives would predict different results. If they can put together such hypotheses, then they can see whether empirical evidence fits one theory better than the other. The basic hypothesis they can come up with looks simply at the number of social ties that people have with each other. They remain a little hazy about exactly whether such ties can be classified as primary or secondary, a key distinction in Wirth's original formulation, but they claim that the two theories predict different results even for the simple number of such relationships. Quote, Fisher's subcultural theory implies that the diversity of urban life actually enhances the number of social ties, especially those of what might be described as a voluntaristic nature, unquote. If people report having fewer friends, according to this logic, it might be because their primary ties have been disrupted by urban anomie. So finding smaller numbers of social ties for people in cities might be interpreted as support for Louis Wirth, while finding larger numbers of social ties for people in cities might be interpreted as support for Claude Fisher. They also discuss some other aspects of people's relationships, but this look at simple numbers of contacts as their basic starting point. Once they have this starting point for testing the theories against each other, they next must decide how to measure urban. They criticize some other work that was being published at the time they were working on this paper, saying that it is not enough to draw one simple line between urban and rural settings, perhaps with a cutoff point of places smaller or larger than 10,000 people. Instead, they propose several components of urbanism. The first of these they call metropolitanism. This refers to the total size of an entire metropolitan area, from a huge urban region like Los Angeles, Houston, or Atlanta, to a relatively small metro area like Tallahassee, Florida. The logic behind this distinction is that the larger a metro area grows, the more specialized, fast-paced, anonymous, and urban it becomes. at least at the heart of the area, usually in the city center. This brings up the second feature of urban location they want to consider, the distance that a person lives from that city center. Here we can see the influence of the urban ecologists who drew abstract models of cities as concentric rings, with the urban core in the center. Curtis White and Guest take for granted that there is such a center, and also that in that central city life will be more urban in the sense of either Worth's urban anomie theory or Fisher's subcultural theory. Their starting hypotheses might remind you a little of a pyramid. The closer you go to the middle, the higher up you climb on the scale of urbanism, no matter what effect you think that may have on people. The bigger the city, the taller the pyramid, and so the more intense the urban effects you can expect at the center. As a starting hypothesis, this is not a bad choice. It resonates strongly with much of what other scholars have said about city life. When it comes to actually studying the social relationships of people, they turn to one of the earliest efforts to collect what we now call network data. When social researchers began fielding sample surveys to collect all kinds of information from scientifically selected respondents, the initial approach followed a strategy that has been called methodological individualism. That is, the sampling strategy involved careful work to make sure that a representative sample of individuals would be selected for interviews, but each of these respondents was interviewed as a single data point without reference to much, if any, information about the social context within which each of us is embedded in daily life. This methodological individualism is based on a deeper theoretical individualism, a perspective that has been gaining strength continuously and today exercises almost complete hegemony over social science research, particularly in the United States. This theory holds that the way to understand and predict human attitudes and behavior is to consider the individual person as a self-contained unit of study. So survey research only studied individual respondents, and if they collected any information about a person's social context, it was usually self-reported by the respondent. The rise of social network analysis, however, particularly in the 1980s, quickly revealed that such research strategies couldn't provide the information needed about not only the social ties that a particular respondent might have to other people, but what kind of ties, if any, existed between those other people themselves. The National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago, where else, has been conducting the nationally representative General Social Survey every year or two for over 40 years. In the mid-1980s, a new experimental module was added for one round and one round only of this national survey to collect information about such social network properties. The 1985 GSS module on social networks has been studied extensively for decades. Shortly after the turn of the new century, Curtis White and Guest decided to dust it off and try using it to test the urban anomie and subcultural theories of city life against each other. They focus on 4 network properties or measures, which we will consider in more detail later in the lecture. First, network size. Second, network composition. Third, network density. And finally, frequency of contacts between people. Before looking at these measures, however, it's worth taking a moment to see exactly where these data come from. The 1985 GSS questionnaire started by asking people to identify up to 6 different people that each respondent had talked to over the previous 6 months to discuss important matters. Nobody said what these important matters were. This was up to each respondent to interpret for herself or himself. Then the interviewer asked a second question about how close the respondent felt to each of these people. It is interesting to keep in mind that Curtis White and Guest do not use this second question about closeness for anything in their analysis, even though it might be considered as a way to decide whether a contact is a primary or a secondary relationship. Once the respondent had named up to 6 contacts, the interviewer then went on to a special separate page in the questionnaire and asked how well each possible pair of these other people knew each other. Were they total strangers? Were they especially close? Or were they just casually acquainted? This information has been used in other research to distinguish primary versus secondary relationships, but Curtis White and Guest do not study this aspect of the data. Finally, the GSS interviewer turned to a third page of the questionnaire and asked for some information about personal characteristics of each contact listed by the respondent, including age, sex, race, and relationship to the respondent, such as sister, teacher, neighbor, or spouse. A final question asked how long the respondent had known each person on the list. From this raw material, Curtis White and Guest construct some measures that they hope will help them to judge between the urban anomie and subculture perspectives on city life. The field of social network analysis has a language all its own, including a number of special terms with specific, precise meanings that are slightly different from the way these terms might be used in casual conversation. For example, network size is simple and obvious, just the number of points in the network, in this case, the number of contacts mentioned by each GSS respondent, plus one to include the respondent too. But when network scholars talk about density, they mean something special. A network in which all the possible connections that could be made actually exist is said to have a density of 1.0. For example, there is only one possible connection between two people who form a network together. Such a pair has a density of 1.0 if the connection exists, and 0 if it does not. For 3 people, there are 3 possible links. You can connect a network of 4 people with 6 possible links. For 5 people, there are 10 possible links. For 16 people, there are 15 possible links. In fact, to get the number of possible connections in any network, you just add up all the numbers less than the number of people in the network. The actual density of any network of any size is defined as the proportion of all possible ties that actually exist. A 6-person network with 6 of the 15 possible links would have a density of 0.4 or 40%. From this, you can see that the number of possible connections between people increases much faster than the total size of the network. This fact has been proposed as one reason why primary groups must be small. It is simply impossible for a person to maintain all the possible ties in a larger group and treat all those connections as primary ties. Another feature of a network has to do with the composition of the group. In the second, more sparse network with some possible ties missing, there are also different kinds of members, represented by different colors here. This network has more diversity. Curtis White and Guest consider 2 types of relationship as their measure of composition. They define every tie as either between relatives or between non-relatives. If a relationship is both at once, such as a cousin who is also the respondent's teacher, the family relationship trumps the non-family tie. We can distinguish between different intensity of connections among network members. Lewis Wirth stressed the difference between primary and secondary ties as a critical element in his urban anomie theory. Network scholars don't talk much about this distinction, but they often refer to strong versus weak ties, which have some features in common with the primary-secondary distinction. They may not be precisely the same ideas, but there is definitely a similarity between strong and primary ties, and between weak and secondary ties. Secondary ties are usually represented in a network diagram like these with a dotted rather than a solid line. White and Guest measure this distinction on the basis of how often people said they had interacted with each other person, with at least once a week counting as a strong tie, and less contact than that as a weak tie. Again, we can see that they're not using all the possible information from the survey, because they might instead have counted strong ties as those where the respondent reported feeling particularly close to one or more of these contacts. They even reported whether the contacts were close to each other, too. This just means there's room for somebody else to do a new study taking advantage of such unused information in the survey. Before they can get down to business and test the urban anomie theory against the subcultural theory using these data, though, they have to take some additional precautions. Even at the time they were working on this paper, it was already well known that there are some basic facts about people that are strongly related to the size and shape of social networks that they tend to form. For example, network size, density, and composition tend to vary for people with different levels of education or different ages. Networks tend to be different for men compared to women, and some research suggests that different race and ethnic groups may have different network patterns based on distinctive ethnic subcultures. Since these factors also can be related to whether people live in central cities, suburbs, or rural areas, they must be taken into account so that we don't mistake what could really be an effect due to sex or education and think that it has something to do with urban location. Focus in this article on kin versus non-kin ties might seem a little wide of the mark in terms of testing the theories of Wirth and Fisher. After all, we can't assume that all kinship ties are primary ties. I certainly have cousins that are not part of any primary group in my life, and chances are that you have some primary relationships with people who are not part of your family too. So why do they concentrate on this question of kin versus non-kin ties? The answer seems to be that they believe kin ties to represent something like the pre-urban social solidarity that some scholars see as coming before the appearance of cities. These are involuntary in the sense that they're assigned to you rather than chosen by you. Social scientists call them ascribed rather than achieved relations. In a way, this is the kind of relationship that Lewis Wirth might expect to be broken down by urban anomie. But there are some other questions that we might ask about this research design too. One big problem is that the question asked in the 1985 General Social Survey did not specify that the conversation about important things had to be a face-to-face contact. It would be possible for a person who talked every week on the phone with his or her mother about some personal issue to list the mother as one of the people in this six-person network, even if the mother lived on the other side of the country. In fact, it is likely that quite a few respondents did exactly that. What are we to make of a social network that can include distant people talking over the phone? So should such a network be influenced by an urban social context? Perhaps Curtis White and Guest are reading the anomie theory as saying that city people will be less likely to talk to their mothers, whether the mother lives down the block or on the other side of the country. The other problem that we ought to at least think about is the matter of a limit of 6 names for the list of contacts. Does this ceiling on the size of possible networks cut off some larger social networks that respondents might have reported? This could be a serious problem, if that were true, but at least we can test for this problem. If most of the sample listed all 6 possible names, then we would definitely have a problem. But if most people stopped with 2 or 3, and only a few listed as many as 6, then we could feel a lot more safe about ignoring this possible measurement problem. Once they have worked out all the details about how to construct their network measures, Curtis White and Guest only have to specify how they will measure their urban categories, and they're in business. They decide to take the Census Bureau's definition of a Standard Metropolitan Statistical Area, or SMSA, for finding the size of the entire metro area. An SMSA follows the boundaries of one or more counties that contain a large city, and includes all the people in all those counties. Instead of some kind of sliding scale of distance from the center of the city, they simply grouped GSS respondents into those who lived in the central city, at the core of one of these SMSAs, or in the surrounding suburbs that are part of the urbanized area, or in unincorporated areas that fall inside the counties of the SMSA, but not inside the urbanized area. Then there are other people who live in counties that are not part of any SMSA at all. These small towns and rural areas form their 4th category of urban location. These categories give them a scale of urbanness that runs from the least urban, those areas outside SMSAs, to the unincorporated areas, to the suburbs, and finally to the most urban, the central city at the heart of each SMSA. Curtis White and Guest present the results of their analysis in a series of tables, each with 3 panels of information, one above the other. Each panel shows figures for the social networks of GSS respondents, depending on the urban context where they lived. The top panel in each table shows figures by size of place, referring to the population of the specific town or city they lived in. This is not very useful to us because the town or city could be part of a larger metro statistical area or by itself in the countryside, so we will not pay much attention to these top panels of each table. The second panel shows figures for people who live in the biggest metro areas, smaller metro areas, and outside metro areas. We will concentrate here instead on the third panel in each table, showing results for their centrality measure. That is, whether a respondent lived in a central city, the suburbs of a metro area, the unincorporated area outside urban boundaries but still in a metro county, or outside any metro area, that is, in a small town or rural place. The panel in each table comes closest to capturing the kind of differences that both Worth and Fisher talked about when they speculated on how cities affect social life. The thing we learned from these results is that the average size of reported social networks was about 2 or 3 people for the GSS sample as a whole. So we can at least stop worrying about whether 5 or 6 spaces were enough for listing names on the survey. For most people, clearly this was a high enough maximum. The second thing we can see, shown here as a series of vertical bars to illustrate the figures presented in the table of the article, is that the average size of social networks increased slightly as one goes from non-metro places to unincorporated places in metro areas to incorporated suburbs. For all the results considered here, we of course use the adjusted figures in the tables so that there is no chance that we're mixing in effects of different average ages or educational backgrounds by place and confusing such effects for some kind of urban effect. Only the central city residents showed slightly smaller average numbers than did suburbs for people they talked to about important matters, and this figure was still higher than for non-metro places. So in terms of total network size, it does not look like respondents living in cities talk to fewer people than do respondents in non-urban places. This could be one mark against urban anomie theory, and possibly one in favor of Fisher's idea about urban subcultures. When we turn to the question of density, though, we see a slightly different story. Just as a reminder, density refers to the share of all possible connections that actually exist among the people listed by the respondents for discussing important topics. The average density of these networks moves in just the opposite direction as the absolute size of networks, getting lower as we move from non-metro areas to suburbs, where networks were getting larger, and then rising slightly for central cities, where networks were smaller again. Curtis White and Guest treat this pattern as evidence that people do not seem to be forming subcultures in cities, or at least not in suburbs, because a subculture, as Fisher described it, would be expected to form a dense network of people interacting with each other. But we have to be careful in accepting this conclusion of theirs, because the way that density is calculated might produce the pattern shown here as simply a byproduct of network size. If bigger networks have more trouble to keep all possible connections active, then any group with larger networks should show lower density purely as a result of network size itself. A network of 6 people actually could have a larger absolute number of active ties than a network of 3 people and still get a lower density score because the number of possible ties increases so much faster than the number of people in the group. This is a weak spot in their analysis. The total size of the networks they measure is really the sum of 2 kinds of connections: connections to relatives and connections to friends and other people. If we split apart each of the average network size figures shown earlier, we can see these 2 components separately. Clearly, the number of non-kin ties increases steadily as we move from non-metro places into the central cities. In fact, respondents in central cities reported the largest number of non-kin ties of any location considered. Kin ties also increase in the same way, except for central cities, where we find the lowest average number of kin ties. Curtis White and Guest again look at these patterns as evidence against Worth's urban anomie theory, pointing out that there is no sign of people becoming isolated and losing their ties to other people in urban settings. They also review briefly the patterns they find for their control factors, including sex, age, and education. They confirm what many other scholars, including Fisher himself, have discovered. These effects are actually much stronger than the effects of urban location, so it is very important to take them into account when trying to find any leftover effects that we might attribute to living in cities as a cause. In general, more educated people tend to have larger social networks, women have slightly larger networks than men, and there is a tendency for social networks to get smaller as people grow older. All these patterns appear in the data from GSS respondents in 1985. On the other hand, they also find that age, sex, and education are less important for influencing the density of social networks. Curtis White and Guest refer at several points in their article to a sociological distinction drawn by the German sociologist Ferdinand Tönnies, who wrote about what he called Gemeinschaft, which we often translate into English as community, and Gesellschaft, often translated as association. His idea of Gemeinschaft actually is very close to what early American social scientists called a folk society, usually rural and held together by traditions, shared values, and similar lifestyles of people. People may be more familiar with the Gesellschaft term from its use as the German equivalent for the English term corporation. Big German corporations often have the word Gesellschaft in their name to indicate that they are associations of people organized for a specific purpose, like making cars or operating a chain of hotels. When Tönnies talked about a transition from Gemeinschaft to Gesellschaft in modern societies, he was describing the same process of change that Adna Weber, Lewis Wirth, and others described as the transition from folk to urban society, with the same shift from personal relationships to impersonal standardization for human interactions. But Curtis White and Guest here use their evidence to call into question the whole idea of community or Gemeinschaft. They point out that, quote, small communities in relatively rural counties have the lowest number of total ties, unquote. To them, this could mean that such rural areas are not really reservoirs of primary groups, strong shared values, and tight social networks that create a sense of close-knit community. In fact, rural areas may suffer from more isolation and anomie than is found in urban areas. This possibility again seems to them like more evidence against the urban anomie theory. In fairness to Lewis Wirth, though, we have to think back to what he actually said about the effects of urban life. He did not say that anomie would only appear in central cities. He said that the new, depersonalized, and standardized way of life created by urban society would spread out and eventually transform the lives of any remaining rural population, just as it had already done for the people in central cities. Rural life on the fringes of an urban society should not be expected to look the same as rural life in a pre-industrial culture where most people remain farmers and a traditional culture continues to dominate people's lives. So in the end, we have to admit that this attempt to pin down the urban anomie theory of Wirth or the subcultural theory of Fisher runs into a lot of problems, both conceptual weaknesses and trouble in terms of what they can actually measure and study compared to what these theories might predict. It is a frustrating business to try to test such theories when we don't have the kind of control over our subject matter that laboratory scientists enjoy. But this doesn't mean we shouldn't keep trying.